Saturday, August 8th. A runner came back from our foremost elements this morning to report that the airport, prize of the Guadalcanal invasion, has been reached and that as yet no contact has been made with the enemy. But one of our sentries, who had a post last night at the outskirts of our coconut grove, said that at just about daybreak, a patrol of about 150 Japs passed close by our bivouac and then took off into the bush. Colonel Hunt pointed up the morale. "This is no picnic," he said, obviously concerned over the fact that we have had an easy time of the campaign thus far. "We've got to be careful." The colonel was in exuberant good spirits this morning, probably, I guessed, because he had found that he could undergo the rigours of an all-day hike and feel sturdy the next morning, as he had a quarter of a century ago in the First World War. The colonel set his helmet on the ground, sat himself down on it, and unfolded a map, while his staff, gathered around for the day's orders, watched. "I'll tell you what I know, and then you'll know as much as I do," he said. He pointed a big finger to a spot on the map. "Here's where we are," he said. "We've got to work down there and get to the Tenaru. Probably we'll wade around the mouth of the river." He went into the details of our plans. The colonel passed along the good news that operations on Tulagi and Gavutu across the bay were going well. Tulagi, assaulted by the raiders, was okay, despite heavy resistance, he said. The troops attacking the neighbouring island of Gavutu had taken their first objective, and the rest is in the bag. The colonel folded up his map brusquely, as if he were snapping shut a book he had just finished. "Well," he concluded, "there's the setup. Better get packed up and stand by to move on." He stood up and clapped me on the shoulder. "Well, it looks like we might run into something this morning," he said. "Are you ready for a fight? It looks as if business is picking up." It was plain to see that he was lustily looking for a scrap. But we trudged along through the jungle for miles, reached and forded the river, passed through another coconut grove, scared up a herd of horses, and came out on the beach again, without seeing a single Jap. "I wish those Japs would come out and fight," one sweaty, dirty Marine lamented, indulging in the Marine's favourite adjective for anything distasteful. "All they do is run into the jungle." We passed through a little village of tin-roofed huts on the beach. The white-plastered walls had been holed, and in some cases shattered by the naval gunfire. Evidently, these huts had been used as barracks by the Jap troops, for there were signs bearing Japanese inscriptions hung on the walls. I took one to Lieutenant Corey, the interpreter. "It says Unit No. 3, he said, "in charge of so-and-so." Sailors are amazingly efficient souvenir hunters. I saw some of them here with our advance units. They were busy collecting the Japanese signs. A tank rumbled past us as we plodded down the beach. On the rear of the tank, in large white letters, was painted the name M.J. Bob. Another passed. It carried the name Edna. I stopped to talk with Colonel Frank B. Goetcher, and he told me word had come that casualties, and fighting, had been heavy on Tulagi, Gavutu, and Tanambogo. There were still stubbornly resisting, isolated groups of Japs to be cleaned up on Tulagi, he said, and on Gavutu the Marines had lost a lot of men. Estimates of casualties ran as high as 60%. The Marines had had a particularly good deal of trouble in trying to get across the causeway between Gavutu and Tanambogo, he said. The causeway was only 8 feet wide and 75 yards long, and it was swept by machine gun fire. Colonel Goetger suggested that probably the Japs would be in today to try another attack on the transports, which still lay close offshore, and so, when Colonel Hunt's people cut from the beach back into the jungle, I stayed behind on the shore, and saw one of the most awe-inspiring spectacles I have ever witnessed. It was just noon when the quick-paced whoomp-whoomp of anti-aircraft firing began, and I could see black bursts plastering the whole dome of the sky over Tulagi. I could see the flash of gunfire coming from the grey shape of the Australian cruiser out in the bay. Then the other warships took it up, and the whooping sounds came in overlapping clusters and volleys. Overhead, the canopy of anti-aircraft bursts was spreading thicker and farther over the sky. Then the thunder of the big anti-aircraft guns was augmented by the fierce rattling of smaller anti-aircraft guns, and the whole sound swelled in a quick diapason until it seemed to swarm into your ears. Suddenly I saw the first Jap, a long, flat-shaped plane moving in among the transports like some preying shark, skimming over the water below the level of the masts, and I thought, torpedo plane. Now I could see other Japs, the same flat, sinister shapes, prowling low over the water, darting among the transports, and there were black spouts of water rising amidst them, the splashes of bombs, or perhaps torpedoes being launched by the enemy aircraft. The ships were moving over the horizon now, racing for the narrow straits which led to the open sea, trying to get out before they were hit. But the splashes of bombs and torpedoes were coming more frequently and closer. Our fighter planes dived into the foray. I saw one of them rout a Jap plane out of the fracas and chase it fiercely, with the Jap apparently in panicky flight toward the western tip of Guadalcanal. I heard the popping and rattling of the Americans' machine guns, continuing for seconds on end, and suddenly the Jap began to trail smoke. Then fire came at the root of the smoke plume, and the plane, falling, traced a gorgeous, steadily brightening curve across the sky. I watched, fascinated, while the plane arched into the water, and the slow white fountain of a great splash rose behind it, and then the white turned into brilliant orange as the plane exploded and sent a sheet of flame backfiring 100 feet into the sky. I turned my field glasses back to the transport fleet, in time to see a huge flash of fire burst along the upper deck of one of the transports. Then a clump of sooty black smoke billowed out from the blood-red roots and towered up into the sky. The transport must have been hit directly. Almost simultaneously, 3 other columns of smoke rose just over the rim of the horizon. I surmised that other ships had been hit. The panorama of action stretched all the way from east to west. I had seen one Japanese plane fall in flames far to the left. Now, to the right, 2 others were falling in clouds of smoke. In the center of the picture, the stricken transport was still burning. The red flames mounted into the smoke, spreading belches of fire high up into the cloud as an explosion evidently occurred. But suddenly the sky was empty of Jap planes. The awful storm of firing had stopped. The raid was over. I looked at my watch. It was 12:10. At 12:54 the transports had turned and were moving to their anchorage off our beach. But out in the middle of the bay the badly hit ship was still burning, with her fires evidently out of control. A Marine passing by told me he had counted 6 of the Jap planes falling. I found later that there had been 40 Japanese planes attacking, that 16 of these were shot down on the spot, and the remaining 24 destroyed by our fighters, one by one, as they streaked for home after the raid. The Jap torpedo bombers had not gone after the warships, contenting themselves with merely strafing the transports as they passed by. I started back inland to catch up again with the Marine forces making their way toward the airfield. At 1:30 I passed 2 Marines bringing in the first Jap prisoners, the first enemy people I had seen close to. There were 3 of the Japs, walking in single file, while the Marines, looking huge by comparison, shooed them along like pigeons. The Japs were a measly lot. None of them was more than 5 feet tall, and they were puny. Their skins were sallow. The first 2 in line had shaved heads and were bare from the waist downward. The Marines had been diligent in their search for weapons. The third Jap had been allowed to keep his khaki-coloured trousers. He wore a scraggly beard which made him look even more wretched, and on his head he had a visored cap of cheap cloth with a cloth anchor insignia. The Japs blinked their eyes like curious birds as they looked at me. The first in line gaped, a gold tooth very prominent in the centre of his open mouth. The interpreter, Lot Corey, said he had just interviewed the Japs, and that they had told him they were members of a Navy Labour battalion. They had been captured in a labour camp which lay just ahead. A few minutes later I caught up with the temporary command post in a grove of trees. Major Bill Phipps was riding a captured Jap bicycle up and down a track road which cut through the woods. The bike was apparently brand new, a good-looking job much like the typical English bicycle, with hand brakes and narrow tyres. This was the first of a great stock of booty we were to capture. "There are lots more like this down the road," said Major Phipps, "and lots of other stuff, including trucks." Captain Ringer was about to lead a party to the camp. I went with them. Down the road we passed a few more Marines riding shiny Jap bicycles. One careened amongst a group of marching troops, narrowly missing several. "No brakes," he shouted, but finally he discovered the mechanism for bringing the machine to a stop. An American was being educated in foreign ways. To one side of the road rested 3 Jap trucks, with fresh grey paint and apparently in first-class condition. They looked like the latest American models, but carried a Jap trademark. Across the road sat a Ford Fi-8 sedan, camouflaged in green, and carrying the Jap Navy license plates with white anchor insignia, apparently an official's car. When we entered the Japanese tent camp, we knew why we had been able to sail into Tulagi Bay and under the Jap guns without being fired upon. The enemy had been caught completely unawares. In the first of the big tents, there were scores of them, we burst in upon a breakfast table left completely in medias res. It looked as if the Japs had left by the back door as we came in the front. Serving dishes, set in the middle of the table, were filled with meat stew, rice and cooked prunes. Bowls and saucers around the edge were mostly half full of food. Chopsticks had been left propped on the edges of the dishes, or dropped in haste on the floor mat. In other tents we found more signs that the Japs had run in panicky surprise when our assault began. Shoes, mosquito nets, toilet articles, soap and other essentials had been left behind. Walking through the Jap tent camp, we could see the reason for their hasty withdrawal. Many of the tents had been ripped by He fragments and some knocked flat. Groups of coconut palms were shattered, their trunks rent and tops blown off by shell fire, and in one little grove we found 2 shell-blasted bodies, now well attended by flies. One body sat at the foot of a tree, eyes staring straight ahead. The left leg had been nipped off at the knee, and the lower part of the leg, with the shoe still on the foot, lay a few feet to one side. In another tent, which was an infirmary and completely stocked with drugs and surgical instruments, we found one emaciated patient sitting on his bed of matting. He told Lieutenant Corey that he was suffering from malaria. As we walked on through Jap territory that afternoon, we began to realize the huge quantities of booty we had fallen heir to. Passing by the airport, which was by now completely occupied by our troops, I saw rows of brand-new wooden barracks, so new that the Japs had not yet moved in. I climbed aboard a tank and rode to Lunga Point, and there found the largest Jap camp and great quantities of equipment. We rode past a large grey frame house which I was told contained a Jap electricity plant, ready for use. We passed through a grove where our shells had torn half the trees asunder, and came to a huge motor transport dump complete with repair shop. Here there were at least 100 Jap trucks, Nipponese versions of the Chevrolet. Beyond the truck dump we came to a great camp of tents, the largest we had yet seen, and at a beautiful bend in the river, the buildings which had evidently been the Jap headquarters. Here there were shacks which contained iron beds, handsome French telephone receivers, radios, riding boots standing in corners. The house, which had evidently been occupied by the commanding officer, was well stocked with luxuries such as big bottles of sake, small bottles of wine, a large radio set, and nearby stood a bathtub, crowning luxury on this hot tropical island. Along the road, passing the Jap headquarters, a long line of our own trucks and jeeps, moving personnel and supplies forward, were passing. A captured Japanese car was one of the procession. On the other side of the road, in the Jap truck dump, Marines were starting up the NIP vehicles, most of which, it seemed, were ready to go except for ignition keys. Few of our troops, evidently, had investigated one Jap house with open sidewalls. I wandered in and found a large drafting table equipped with properly up-angled drawing boards in the centre of the building, and a desk on a sort of porch at one end. Around the edge of the room were shelves filled with blueprints, drafting supplies, stocks of paper, record books. This had evidently been the headquarters office. One of the drafting boards had half-finished plans, drawn on tissue paper, pinned to it. The drafting pen lay across the centre of the drawing, evidence of a helter-skelter withdrawal. Nearby, a French phone lay beside its receiver, as if a conversation had been interrupted by our arrival. Around the headquarters buildings I saw great stores of food, stacks of crates filled with canned goods, cases of a soda pop labelled Mitsubi champagne cider, and 2 varieties of Japanese beer. There were also large tins of hardtack and boxes of sweet biscuits. Some of the passers-by had already sampled the Jap canned goods. I saw that there were canned pears and peaches and pineapple, goulash, crab meat, shredded fish and salmon, hardly the primitive diet on which the Japanese is traditionally supposed to subsist. I walked on down the road, seeking Colonel Hunt's command post, past a Jap refrigeration plant, and came to a large warehouse full of food. Obligingly, the Nips had even left cooking kettles behind. Colonel Hunt told me that he had encountered no Japs all day. But as the afternoon sky grew darker and evening came closer, the feeling that we might have walked into a trap grew more pressing. To gain all this booty without a struggle seemed too good to be true. At 4:32 in the afternoon, we had our first alarm. We heard shots to our left and behind us, coming from deep in the woods. A few seconds passed in silence, and then suddenly I heard our men shouting loudly and violently, saw them running for cover, flopping down in the brush to face our left rear. I thought, "This is it! This is the trap! They've got us!" I could see in the faces of the men around me that they thought this was the fight for their lives which they had been expecting. But it was a false alarm. The colonel, afraid that in our nervousness we might fire on our own supporting troops coming up behind, walked boldly through our hasty skirmish lines and down into the woods whence the rifle shots had come. I followed to find the cause of the alarm. 3 Japs had bolted from one of the tents in the camp. Possibly they had been caught there by our advance as they tried to get some food, and they had been shot. 2 were dead. 1 lay on the ground, breathing hard. There was a small bloodstain on the back of his shirt, the colour of wine. A corpsman ripped off the shirt. There was a hole about the size of a dime in the man's back. "He won't last," said the colonel, looking at the wound. "That's an internal hemorrhage." Corpsman came up with a stretcher and carried the wounded man away, and he was given medical treatment, but he died soon after. It was 6:15, and we were back at the command post when one of our officers was brought in on a stretcher. It was Lote Snell, the colonel's aide. Lote Snell was suffering from paralysis, although he could speak. A veteran of the World War, and in his middle years, accustomed to office work, he had been overcome by heat and exertion. An officer told me that Snell had lost consciousness 4 times earlier that day, but kept the matter quiet and attempted to stay with our moving column. The colonel wanted to do something to cheer his aide, so he took Snell's little pocket flag, an 8-inch by 12-inch star-spangled banner which the lieutenant had carried with him in China and the Philippines, and had it hoisted on the bare flagpole at the Japanese headquarters. It was touching to see the little flag, proud but pitifully small, ride up the mast, to see Snell's eyes watching it, and his mouth twisting and contorting, as he tried to smile. In the evening I heard a story which Colonel Hunt had modestly not told me, that he had led the point of our troops crossing the Lunga River. Usually it is a private's or corporal's business to lead the point, the very forefront of an advance. But when the colonel reached the Lunga and found our troops holding back there and anxiously eyeing the forbidding dark woods across the bridge, he had led the way. Behind him went his staff, including the chaplain, Father Reardon, who was unarmed. When we bedded down for the night on the ground, I shared Father Reardon's poncho. We pulled it as closely as possible around us, for the sky looked dark and rainy. We were awakened by gunfire at about 11 o'clock. "There's something moving in the river," somebody said. People all around us were shooting, with submachine guns, pistols, rifles. Again, the tracer bullets made dazzling patterns in the dark. After 10 minutes, the shooting stopped. If there had been any Japs in the river, they were certainly dead, or had retreated by that time. Sunday, August 9th. A little after midnight this morning, the rain began to pour down on Guadalcanal. I withdrew myself from Padre Reardon's poncho and sought refuge in one of the Jap tents. It was fairly well filled already with Marines, but I found a place to lie down and slept until about 1 o'clock, when men all round me began to stir and talk, and coming half awake, I heard the sound of a plane buzzing overhead. It did not sound like one of our planes. The motor had a ragged, high-toned sound. We all stopped talking and listened. "It's a Jap," somebody said. A few minutes later we had the proof. In the direction of the beach where we had landed, a greenish-white glow flickered in the sky. It was a flare. We stood in the drizzling rain, silently, and watched while the Jap cruised over Guadalcanal, dropping flares in several sectors of the sky. Was this the prelude to a Jap landing, we wondered? The plane came over us 3 times, and then we heard the sound of the motor growing fainter and fainter until it had gone. I had just dropped off to sleep again, when again I woke to find people whispering, and this time to hear the broom, broom, broom of cannonading coming from the sea, evidently quite close. It had stopped raining. We stood in a quiet group under the palms, listening and watching. The flashes of the gunfire were filling the sky, as bright and far-spreading as heat lightning. And a few seconds after each flash, we could hear the booming of the guns that had caused it. The salvos of firing came with increased intensity, so that the sky was lighted by the quick flashes for minutes on end, and the rumbling of the firing had almost a continuous sound. Then, for a few moments, the flashes and the booming stopped. The sky was quiet, and then the cannonading began again, seeming louder, brighter, and closer than before. We knew then that there was a sea fight going on. Possibly it was the Battle for Guadalcanal. Possibly, if our people out there lost the battle, the Japs would be ashore before morning, and we would have to fight for our lives. We knew the fate of all of us hung on that sea battle. In that moment I realized how much we must depend on ships even in our land operation, and in that moment I think most of us who were there watching the gunfire suddenly knew the awful feeling of being pitifully small, knew for a moment that we were only tiny particles caught up in the gigantic whirlpool of war. The terror and power and magnificence of man-made thunder and lightning made that point real. One had the feeling of being at the mercy of great accumulated forces far more powerful than anything human. We were only pawns in a battle of the gods then, and we knew it. The cannonading continued, booming loud and bright and stopping, then starting again for an hour and a half, and we stood and watched, speculating as to what was happening out there. Meanwhile, a Jap plane came to buzz overhead in the dark and drop flares, over the beach where we had landed, over the airport, out over the sea to the northwest, whence the firing was coming. At about 2:30, some of the men said they were sure the sound of cannonading was growing fainter, and that this meant the Japs were being driven back. At 3 o'clock, the last ponderous barrage of firing came to an end. I sought refuge this time in a Japanese sedan, probably the Jap commander's vehicle, which had been left at the side of the road. The soft cushions felt good. Except for the slight disturbance of being bitten by mosquitoes, I was quite comfortable for the rest of the night. This morning I made a trek to the temporary command post of General Vandergrift. The general, a red-cheeked, exceedingly affable man, told me that the casualties on the other side of the bay, on Tulagi and Gavutu, have not been as heavy as at first estimated. On both islands the Japs holed themselves up in caves and dugouts, he said, and fought to the last man. The conquest of Tanambogo was complete, he said, and today the smaller island Macambo was being taken. The Marines also had a secure foothold on the largest island across the bay, called Florida or Ngela. That was good news. But there was no news as yet about what happened in the sea battle to the northwest this morning. Back at Colonel Hunt's command post in the late afternoon, I heard an amusing story. Our forces reaching Kukum, which had been an enemy strongpoint but was abandoned when we arrived, found many guns ready to fire, complete with ammunition this morning. Among the guns was a 3-barreled pom-pom of about 1-inch bore. The Marines fired a few test rounds from the pom-pom today, and the shells fell into the water halfway between Kukum and Matanikau, which is the next village down the coast. Soon after the shells hit, a white flag was raised over Matanikau, indicating that there are Japs in that village and that they are anxious to surrender. Apparently, said the colonel, the Japs thought that the pom-pom was firing at them, and they got frightened. But the humorous part of the situation was that the Marines were so busy, checking over the captured guns at Kukum and setting up new batteries there, that going down to take the Japanese at Matanikau would have been only a nuisance. So the Marines kept on about their work, ignoring the frightened Japs. And that, it seems, must have been the most awful blow of all to the Jap morale, in view of the Oriental concept of face. Monday, August 10. This morning I went to Kukum to join a patrol of Marines going to Matanikau to investigate the Jap offer to surrender. Kukum, I found, was a group of tin-roofed shacks along the coast, with a few little piers built out into the water. The shacks had been severely damaged by our shelling. There was scarcely a wall that was not pocked by he fragments. Behind the row of houses and shacks, shells had ripped into a coconut grove and struck squarely into a gasoline dump. It was here that we had seen the great fire on the morning of our landing. Evidently explosions had run through the fuel dump like wildfire, for the charred drums were puffed up like burned marshmallows, as if they had exploded from the inside outwards. But here too, I was told, much usable material had been captured by our people, including food, an abundance of machinery, and some untouched stores of gasoline and oil, as well as the guns and ammunition. The plan of our patrol to Matanikau today was explained to me by Captain Kayempfer, who was leading the expedition. The pom-poms were going to fire a few more rounds in the direction of the Jap-occupied village, in the hope that the white flag would be run up again. Then our patrol would be in a position to move in and investigate. That was the plan. What actually happened was far different. As we were about to start, Captain Gale urged us to watch carefully for snipers. One of his men was shot in the stomach by a Jap last night before the Jap was killed, he said, and another Marine was shot in the leg this morning, without ever seeing his assailant. Assailant. I don't want to be an alarmist, said Captain Gale, but there might be snipers in any of these trees. It's best to keep a sharp lookout. We watched the trees carefully as we moved out of the bivouac area and started down the coast, keeping about a quarter of a mile inland so as to avoid being seen by the enemy during our approach to Matanikau. But we saw no Japs for some hours, though there were several false alarms. At about 9:30, a runner appeared from one of our flanking platoons as we halted for a rest. "Captain," he said to Captain Kayempfer, "there are some Japs over to our left rear." At the word, our men scattered and took cover, but no Japs developed. At 10:10 we saw the figure of a man at the foot of a tree, down the path ahead of us. He appeared to be wearing brown clothing. The brown mass did not move as we approached. Soon we could see that it was a Jap sitting by the tree with a blanket drawn up over his knee. At about 50 yards, Captain Kayempfer levelled his pistol at the man, but the captain did not pull the trigger, for the figure still sat as motionless as stone. The captain slipped the pistol back into his holster. "Never mind," he said. "He's dead." At 10:17, Captain Kayempfer halted our column. "There are people ahead of us," he said. He had a good long look with his field glasses. "I think they're Marines," he said. They were, a platoon which had gotten ahead of our advance. "We thought you were going to open fire on us," said one of the lads as we caught up with them. "We almost did," said Captain Kayempfer with emotion. We had heard the pom-poms firing their scheduled rounds behind us, but when I peeped through the foliage along the shore and had a look in the direction of Matanikau, there was no white flag visible. Not today. We paused in a clearing where a few tall breadfruit trees stood, chalk-white and stately, and a deserted thatch hut squatted in the grass. This clearing, we knew, was quite close to Matanikau, but after the long march without contacting any enemy and the several false alarms of the morning, we were disinclined to believe we would run into any force of Japs. I talked with 2 Marines who told me, with great gusto, how they had fought and killed 2 Japs last night. "We were looking in some tents at Kukum," said Corp, Edward P. Anteki. "When I saw the Japs, I hollered and we started after them. They ran and got in behind a bush and started shooting. We charged right at them," continued Corp. Anteki. "I only had a pistol, so I had to get right on top of them before I could shoot. I fired 5 or 6 shots." Private Reynolds was eager to tell his story of the action. "There were 2 Japs like stragglers," he said. "They got in a hole. We ran right in on them. I used up a whole clip of bullets while we were running up. I had to dive into a hole and get out another clip and load, so I could shoot some more." I asked PVT Reynolds if charging the Japs in the open was not a dangerous procedure. "As long as they're trying to sight on you, you're all right," he said. "If they're aiming at you, they can't hit you." There was a little crack at the edge of the clearing where we had halted. A rickety bamboo bridge crossed the creek, and beyond it lay a thick tangle of jungle foliage. The trail which we had followed thus far, however, continued through the jungle, a good, wide swath. I stood on our side of the bridge and looked down this trail with my field glasses and saw something that made me start. 3 or 4 tense figures of men stood in the centre of the trail, several hundred yards away. They were looking in our direction. Others of our people had spotted the Japs, for Japs they were, but for the moment we were not sure. There were 3 or 4 of us standing in the path, looking at the Japs, and they were squinting at us, not yet sure that we were enemies. "Those are our men," said one Marine. "I don't think they are," said another. And in the quick flash of a moment, we were sure, and the Japs were sure. "Take cover," someone shouted, and we hit the ground, while simultaneously the Japs vanished from the trail, disappearing as quickly as a frightened school of fish. After that, we formed up quickly and pushed across the bridge and down the trail. Now we kept cautiously to the sides of the trail, using the trees as protection. Squads spread out fan-like to the left, in the jungle and to the right, along the beach to protect our flanks. At 11:10 we heard the cry, "Halt!" to our left and ahead, and there was a rifle shot, which was in turn answered by another shot of a peculiarly sharp, high pitch. Then there was a burst of machine gun fire, then silence, as we pushed forward along the trail. "What happened?" I asked a Marine who looked very nervous. "It sounded like a Jap .25 caliber to me," he said. At 11:20, a runner came in from our right flank to say that 2 Jap landing boats had been found on the beach. I worked my way to the beach, through a tangle of vines, ferns, and stunted pineapple plants, and had a good look at the boats. They were about 40 feet long, with gunnels ornamentally curved like a pagoda, not like the straight, powerful lines of our own landing boats. Each had a bin-like hold for troops and a movable ramp, which could be let down to allow the troops passage to a beach at the bow. There was a small wheelhouse with a shield of metal plate at the stern, but the shield was obviously ineffective, for on one of the boats it was punctured on both sides by bullet holes. The Japanese had evidently been living aboard this craft. In the little cramped cabin under the wheelhouse we found bottles of sake, cases of hardtack, and cans of meat. Also a small envelope containing a spent bullet, obviously one of those which had raked the wheelhouse and had been kept as a souvenir by one of the Japs. It was 11:40, and we were working our way down the beach at the fringe of the jungle when there came a sudden spattering of sharp rifle reports to our left and ahead. Deeper-toned rifles took up the chorus, machine guns joined in, and the shower of sound became a rainstorm. Jap riflemen and machine gunners had opened up on our left flank, and our own rifles, submachine and machine guns were returning the fire. The sound of firing was coming from farther down the beach too, and it took me only a second or two to flop amidst a row of Marines who had taken cover behind a long white log which lay athwart the strip of sand. We lay there a few minutes while the Marines fired down the beach and into the jungle on the left, and then I noticed all of a sudden that our lads had pulled their heads down, way down, and were lying extremely flat on the sand. In a minute I knew the reason. A Marine on the far end of the log had been hit. He was holding one hand over the lower part of his face. "Corpsman!" somebody shouted. "Pass the word back for a corpsman. We've got a wounded man here." The exchange of firing grew hotter. The Marines behind the log had spotted 2 Japs down the beach. They were firing with automatic rifles set for full automatic fire. The Japs answered with flat-toned, rapid-paced machine gun fire. Down the beach, one of the Japs had jumped up and was running for the jungle. "There he goes!" was the shout. "Riddle him!" And riddled he was. There was a lull in the firing. I scrambled for the jungle fringe and worked my way back to the trail. I had just reached the edge of it when another fusillade of firing broke out ahead of me. Again I heard the shout, "Pass the word back for a corpsman." As I crawled along the edge of the trail in the direction from which the firing had come, a breathless Marine told me the news. "Loot, Gately's been shot," he said. Again the request for a corpsman came back. There were 3 of these medical aides near me. I saw one of the 3, pharmacist's mate Wesley Haggard, get to his feet and start forward. "Hell, I'll go," he said. "Might as well get shot now as any time." But he did not get shot. For some reason, the Japs were holding their fire for a few moments. The moments lengthened into minutes. I got up and followed in Haggard's steps. The Japs did not fire. The lull in the firing continued, and more Marines left their cover and began to walk forward in the open along the trail. It was a favourite Japanese stunt, as we found out before this day was over, to hold their fire until we got very bold and forgot about cover and then start shooting. I found loot, Gately lying on his back and smoking a cigarette. Corpsman Haggard had tended him well. Clean white bandage had been placed over wounds in the chest and one leg. "How do you feel?" I asked Gately, realizing the question was foolish. But what else, after all, can one say to a wounded friend? "Okay," he said, and tried to smile. He motioned feebly toward his chest. "Only flesh wound," he said. "I saw the Jap sighting in on me," he said. "Thought it was a Marine. Said, 'Hold your fire.' Then I saw it was a Jap. We both tried to fire. Both had safeties on. Couldn't." Gately grinned. Jap got off the first shots, he said. I got off burst of 5. One of the shots loot. Gately had fired from his submachine gun, said a Marine, had hit the Jap in the lungs. He's over there under a tree now, said the Marine. I found the Jap lying on his back with his legs drawn up. He was mute and his face was expressionless. His beady little eyes blinked a bit, but his breathing was very faint. Pretty far gone, said Corman Haggard, standing next to me. Back on the trail I saw another of our wounded in the grass. A truss of bandages covered one side of his chest. He had been shot through the shoulder. The man whom I had seen hit on the beach was not badly wounded. Evidently a ricochet bullet had struck him in the mouth. Now the trail was fairly well filled with Marines, and so the Japs began to fire again. First came the crack of a rifle ahead, then several more, apparently coming from all sides and above. We took cover before the Japs could score any hits. I crouched amidst some sharp-edged pineapple plants behind a tree, but the Japs were firing from our rear now. Evidently there were snipers in the trees back there. It was hard to take cover under the circumstances. I heard a bullet go pfft over my head, and another plop into the underbrush beside me. I moved into a denser part of the jungle, quickly. Then the firing stopped. Our officers held a hasty council of war, and it was decided to return to Kukum and come back to Matanikau later with a greater force of troops and clean out the Japanese sniper net. So, sending our wounded back on a jeep, we made the long, tedious trek back to base. At Kukum, we heard scuttlebutt about the great sea battle which was fought yesterday to the northwest of Guadalcanal. In that battle, which had kept us aware and worried through much of the early morning, 5 of our cruisers had been lost, according to the rumour. 5 Japanese cruisers had also been sunk in subsequent action yesterday. That was the story. There was no official word on the matter at Marine Corps headquarters, except the announcement that the Australian cruiser Canberra had been sunk. Later it was learned that we had lost 4 cruisers in the battle of the early hours of yesterday morning. The ships were the Canberra, the Astoria, the Vincennes and the Quincy. In the evening I went to a tent camp near the seashore, the camp of Captain Hawkins, who had been my roommate aboard ship during the approach to Guadalcanal. Captain Hawkins told me his assault company, which with Captain Kempfer's troops had seized the beachhead on Guadalcanal, had encountered no resistance the first day. They had captured 5 Jap labourers, and that was all. Captain Hawkins, I found, had achieved the honour of being the first American invader to set foot on Guadalcanal. His boat had hit the shore first. Captain Kempfer's boat, the second to touch shore, had been about 75 yards behind. I decided to spend the night in Captain Hawkins's tent, and was weary enough, after the long day's trek and excitement, to settle down to a good sleep. But just as darkness was setting in, we got word that a submarine had been sighted offshore. That made the business of sleeping difficult, especially in view of the fact that our tent was only some 200 yards from the water's edge. Would the Jap counter-invasion come tonight? Would the submarine or submarines come in close and shell our camp? Whatever happened, we would bear the brunt of it. The other officers in the tent were jittery. They talked like magpies, without ever a breathing space, far into the night. The favourite topic was home. Fortunately, there was no landing attempt, no shelling by Japanese submarines that night. Tuesday, August 11, it was a quiet day. At headquarters I learned that the transport which I had seen burning so brightly after the air raid of August 8th had been the George F. Elliot, that when all efforts failed to bring her raging fires under control, she was torpedoed by one of our own destroyers. The USS Jarvis, a destroyer, was attacked that day, but the fact that the Japs had lost all of the attacking planes more than evened the score. We heard the news from Tulagi that conquest of objectives in that area had been virtually completed, except for isolated snipers. Tulagi, Gavutu, Tanambogo were conquered and thoroughly occupied by our troops. We had a good foothold on Florida Island. About 400 Japs had been killed on Tulagi, 800 on Gavutu and Tanambogo, we heard. Bob Miller, the only other news correspondent on the island, and I made arrangements to go to Tulagi tomorrow. Our patrols failed to contact any concentrations of Japs on Guadalcanal today. Lookouts along the shore reported seeing several Jap submarines, but there was no shelling of our shore positions during the day or at night. The night's sleep was undisturbed, extremely welcome. Wednesday, August 12. Down at the beach early this morning, and, after considerable delay, finally boarded the small fleet of 3 motorboats which was to take us to Tulagi. 2 of the craft were the regulation type of landing boat. The third was a lighter filled with drums of gasoline. For armament, we had .30 caliber guns on the landing boats and .50 caliber on the lighter. As we set out in the glaring sun, Marine Gunner Banter, in charge of our boat, warned our crew to keep an especially sharp lookout for airplanes. Also, he said, for submarines. But I could see that our crewmen spent most of their time anxiously watching the sky, that their principal worry was a strafing attack from the air, which turned out to be a mistake in judgment. 3 times before we reached the middle of Tulagi Bay, Gunner Banter borrowed my field glasses to investigate an object in the sky. Twice the objects were birds. The third time there had been an excited warning from Seaman John R. Tull, who manned one of our machine guns. Gunner Banter took the field glasses and focused them nervously. "It's a plane," he shouted, and our machine guns swung around and angled toward the sector of the sky where he had been looking. Then suddenly, we could all see the plane. It was coming straight for us. I suppose in that moment we all realized how helpless is a small boat under the attack of a well-armed aircraft. One felt suddenly very much alone, out there in the middle of the bay, with at least 10 miles of water on every side. "Don't shoot until we've identified it," ordered Banter, as our gunners pulled back their bolts and charged their machine guns. "Remember, there's a PBY scheduled to come in today." So we waited, tensely, while the spot of the plane against the sky grew larger. And then at last we could see the distinct outline of a seaplane hull, the high wing and twin motor nacelles of a P-boat. "It's ours," said Gunner Banter, and we began to breathe freely again. The pretty flying boat came toward us for a few miles more, then swung in a slow curve toward the shore of Guadalcanal. We moved happily on our way. The small green spot that was Tulagi and the rugged blue backdrop of Florida Island were looming larger and more distinctly on our horizon. We had only about 4 or 5 miles still to go to reach our destination. The few flecks of spray that came over our bow felt good and cool, and the breeze caused by our movement was refreshing. "I think that may be a submarine over there," said someone in the boat, and we looked where he pointed, with a great inclination to disbelieve. But it was a submarine, a long, low black shape, with a rise at the center where the conning tower stood. He was moving away from us. But when we spotted him, he also spotted us. Slowly he swung around and headed so as to cross our bows. He was now a mile or 2 from us, to our port side and ahead. We could see the line of white spray threading along the base of the slim black hull as he picked up speed. We were going to have a race on our hands. We knew that then, and I knew that I would not again scoff at the melodramatic formula of race for life or race with death as being improbable. In our little boat there was confusion for a few moments as everybody shouted at once. There was some doubt as to what we should do. Should we run back for Guadalcanal or head for the open sea or cut for the eastern right-hand tip of Florida Island and try to reach it before the Jap cut us off? There was no time for debate. Gunner Banter gave the order to head for Florida, and coxswain Charles N. Stickney swung our helm sharply to the right and opened the throttle. Our boat began to jar and pound against the choppy waves as we suddenly picked up speed, and sheets of spray bowled over the bow and drenched us. The other boats of our little fleet were also pounding along at full speed, tossing plumes of white spray over their cockpits. But the submarine was gaining. It was evident that he was moving swiftly, that our race with him was going to be close, and that we might have to swim for it, even if we won the race. There was one item we had not even considered: shellfire. It was a horrifying sight to see geysers of water leaping up between us and the submarine, for we knew then that he was ranging in on us. We heard the sharp bang of the shells exploding, and knew they would soon be coming dangerously close. Then there were more geysers, closer to the submarine, and we were mystified for a moment, until we heard the booming of gunfire coming from Tulagi shore. We knew then, and were thankful, that a shore battery was opening up on the submarine. But the shells were not yet falling near the sub, and each time he fired his gun, he ranged closer to us. I tried to fix my field glasses on the submarine, but our boat jerked and bounced so, and the spray doused the lenses in such steady downpour that the attempt was futile. Our clothes were soaking. I started to wrap my field glasses in my field jacket, then undid the bundle. No use trying to keep things dry. We were going to have to swim for it. I could see that. The submarine was gaining on us, and a shell landed only 100 yards or so astern of us. Just then we saw that the men in the other landing boat were waving wildly at us. One of the seamen had jumped up on the boat's motor hatch and was trying to send us a message by signal flag. A haze of smoke was coming from the motor hatch of the other boat. We could see that it was in trouble. Our boat swung over next to the crippled one, and we bumped gunwales, pulled apart, and smashed together again as the two boats, running at top speed, ran parallel courses. The crew of the other craft fell, slid, and vaulted into our boat. Lieutenant Herb Merilat, Marine Public Relations Officer and ordinarily quite a dignified young man, jumped over from the other boat and landed, a disordered collection of arms and legs, on the bottom of our boat. He was wearing white socks. In the haste of the moment, he had left his shoes behind. Even in that moment, the sight of his descent was humorous. But we had lost precious time in picking up the other crew. Now the submarine had gained a good lead, and our fate seemed hopeless. I told myself that this was my last day of existence, as it seemed certain to be. But the splashes of the shore batteries firing were coming closer to the submarine now. We saw several that appeared to be only a few yards from the conning tower, and one of our crewmen shouted, "Smoke! She's smoking!" I could not see any smoke, but it was evident that the shells were now beginning to come too close to the submarine for his comfort, for the sub was turning away from us and toward the open sea to the west. We were saved by the bell. The ordeal was over. We sailed into the calm waters of Tulagi Harbour, down the narrow passage of water walled by greenery, and came to a small wooden dock. It was distinctly a pleasure to set foot on land again. The buildings along the shore did not seem greatly damaged by shell fire, although some of the walls were pocked by bullet holes. We made our way to a frame house where, we had been told, we would find General Rupertus and the officers of his staff. General Rupertus was a dynamic type, younger than the average general. He showed us to a bare room where we sat on the edge of a table while we talked. This was his office. There had not been much time to set up the creature comforts on Tulagi. The general summarized the fighting on Tulagi, Gavutu, and Tanambogo. The toughest job, he said, had been to clean out scores of dugout caves filled with Japs. Each cave, he said, had been a fortress in itself, filled with Japs who were determined to resist until they were all killed. The only effective way to finish off these caves, he said, had been to take a charge of dynamite and thrust it down the narrow cave entrance. After that had been done, and the cave blasted, you could go in with a submachine gun and finish off the remaining Japs. The Jap dugouts, dungeons, the general called them, had been found in great numbers on Tulagi and Gavutu. Exterminating them had been a tedious job, particularly on Tulagi, where only yesterday the last of them had been finished off. "You've never seen such caves and dungeons," said the general. "There would be 30 or 40 Japs in them, and they absolutely refused to come out, except in 1 or 2 isolated cases." The general was enthusiastic about the bravery the Marines had displayed in the fighting here. "There should be 40 or 50 congressional medals awarded to these people," he said. "I don't know how to express it," he said, and it was plain to see that he was having difficulty putting his admiration into words. "I think the United States should be just as proud of these people who gave their lives," he began, and paused, groping for a sufficiently glorious phrase, but it would not come. He finished the sentence lamely, "gave their lives in the most wonderful work in our history." He tried again. "I mean that when it comes to bravery, there isn't anybody in the world that can beat us," he said. "I don't think the United States has an episode in its history that can touch what's been done here." We talked to Colonel Edson, commanding officer of the raiders, who had assaulted and taken Tulagi. He was a wiry man with a lean, hard face, partly covered by a sparse, spiky growth of greyish beard. His light blue eyes were tired and singularly red-rimmed in appearance, for he was weary now from long days of fighting, and his red eyebrows and eyelashes, being almost invisible, heightened the effect. But his eyes were as cold as steel, and it was interesting to notice that even when he was being pleasant, they never smiled. He talked rapidly, spitting his words out like bullets, his hard-lipped mouth snapping shut like a trap. Hardly a creature of sunlight and air, he but I could see that he was a first-class fighting man. Colonel Edson summarized the Tulagi campaign. The Japs had one battalion of about 450 men on the island, he said. They were all troops, no laborers. All of their defenses were located on the southeast part of the island. Our landing was at 8:15 a.m. on Friday, August 12th at the northwest part. There were only small obstructionist groups out there. The Japanese casualties were about 400. Not a single nip gave up. In one of the holes there were 17 dead Japs when a man went in to get the radio, but there were still 2 nips alive. They hit the man and one other who followed him later. It was the same in all the dugouts. We found that an officer was alive in one of them. We sent an interpreter out to get him. The interpreter came to the mouth of the cave and asked if the officer wanted to surrender. The answer was a grenade. The northwest section of the island, where we landed, was very thick bush, jungle country. There were only a few enemy outposts along the coast in that sector, and we lost only one man from sniper fire as we went into the beach. Our plan was to go inland to a ridgeline which ran the length of the island, and then change direction and work along the ridge, giving the men on top of the ridge a position to shoot down. The terrain was difficult. It took us 3 hours to get through 1.5 miles of ground. As we came out of the jungle, we really ran into trouble. There, the Nips had 200 men in dugouts and rock emplacements with snipers scattered around. Even after we got control, machine gun nests in dugouts held up our advance for several hours. It was impossible to approach the Nip dugouts except from one direction. You had to crawl up on the cliffs and drop dynamite inside while you were under fire all the time. While the right flank of the raiders was occupied in trying to root out the Japanese dugouts, said the colonel, the center and left flank pushed around the Jap center of opposition and down the ridge which formed the backbone of the island. They met fierce resistance from snipers and machine gunners, and one company suffered 15% casualties, including 2 officers. The snipers would lie still until our men passed, then shoot from the rear, said Colonel Edson. There were snipers everywhere in trees or buildings behind rocks. Despite opposition and casualties, the raiders drove down the ridgeback of the island, said the colonel, until they ran into a shovel-shaped ravine with 3 steep sides. Here they met the stiffest Jap resistance. The walls of the ravine surrounded a flat space which the British had used as a cricket field. Now the Japs had dug innumerable large caves into the limestone walls of the ravine, and from the narrow mouths of these dugouts they fired rifles, automatic rifles, and machine guns. There was continuous crossfire across the ravine, said the colonel. By the time the Marines reached this area, it was dusk, and they halted for the night. But the Japs were organizing a counterattack. At 10:30 that night, the Japs counterattacked, said the colonel. They broke through between C and A companies, and C Company was temporarily cut off. The Japs worked their way along the ridge and came to within 50 to 75 yards of my command post. The Nips were using hand grenades, rifles, and machine guns. We suffered quite a few casualties, as our men fought hard to hold the Japs back. One machine gun company lost 50% of its non-commissioned officers. Finally, the enemy was thrown back. The next day, the raiders, aided by support troops under Colonel Rosecrans, cleaned up the southeastern end of the island. The Nips were still in the pocket, but we had positions for machine guns and mortars on 3 sides of them. We closed in on the pocket and cleaned up some of the dugouts. By 3 o'clock that afternoon, we had complete physical control of the island. A few groups of snipers and machine gunners remained. It took days to finish them off. The Nip defense was apparently built around small groups in dugouts with no hope of escape. They would stay in there as long as there was one live Jap. There was a radio for communication in nearly every one of these holes. We pulled out 35 dead Japs from one dugout. In another, we took out 30. Some of these people had been dead for 3 days, but others were still in there shooting. In none of these places was there any water or food. The Nips had evidently made a dash for their dugouts when the naval bombardment came, without stopping for provisions. In one case, there were 3 Japs cornered. They had 1 pistol. They fired the pistol until they had 3 shots left. Colonel Edson listed some of the outstanding heroes among his raider troops. Major Kenneth D. Bailey had acted with great bravery in trying to knock out a Jap dugout emplacement which was holding up our advance. The cave was dug in the ravine, said the colonel. The enemy fire was so severe that our men could not advance. Bailey got on top of the cave by crawling. He tried to kick a hole in the top. When that failed, he tried to kick the rocks away at the foot of the entrance. While he was attempting to do that, one of the nips stuck out a rifle and shot him in the leg. Then there was Gunnery Sergeant Angus Goss, a one-man demolition squad. When one Japanese cave had resisted with particular stubbornness, Sergeant Goss had tried throwing in hand grenades, and these had been promptly returned by the Japs inside. The sergeant then tried holding the grenades for 3 seconds before hurling them, but even in this case the Japs caught the missiles and threw them back. The patient sergeant then got TNT and thrust it into the hold, but the Japs shoved the TNT out of the cave and the dynamite exploded outside, driving splinters into Goss's leg. He then got mad and went into the cave firing full tilt with his submachine gun and killed the 4 Japs who remained alive. 8 other dead Japs were found in the dugout. We visited the cricket field ravine where the toughest Jap resistance had been met. The stink of rotting bodies was very noticeable. We passed several piles of shattered rock lying against one of the limestone sides of the ravine. These were cave mouths which had been blown in with dynamite. Some of the cave mouths were intact. Braving the odour of the dead inside, the raiders had not found time yet to bury their foes. One could see that the entrances to these Jap strongholds were long and narrow, affording very good defensive positions. We had to step over 6 or 7 bodies which lay in front of one of the cave mouths. They were bloated like overstuffed sausages. Other bodies were scattered over the floor of the ravine. We talked with several other staff officers before we shoved off in a landing boat for Gavutu. One was Lieutenant Commodore Robert L. Strickland, Director of Air Support Operations. Commodore Strickland told us how all the Jap planes in the Tulagi vicinity, 18 in number, had been destroyed before they could get into the air on the morning of August 7th. Our Navy fighter planes caught all the Jap planes on the water or on their ramps at Gavutu, he said. There were 9 seaplane fighters, 1 4-engine bomber and 8 seaplanes. They were set afire, most of them sank, and all were destroyed. We had no air opposition here. Flight Officer Cecil E. Spencer, one of the Australian guides who had accompanied our landing forces, told us how his boat had been the first invading craft to touch the soil of the Solomon Islands. The Marine troops which he had accompanied had hit the beach at the western end of Florida Island, near Haleta village, at 7:40 on the morning of August 7th. They were under the command of a Captain Crane. They had encountered no opposition in landing, although they discovered traces of Japs in 1 or 2 native houses in the village. Leaving an outpost on a hill which commanded Haleta, Captain Crane, Flight Officer Spencer, and the larger part of these Marine troops had left the area. They were then ordered to Gavutu to reinforce the embattled troops who had landed there at midday. We reached Gavutu at about dusk, said Flight Officer Spencer, but by that time Tanambogo was under control. The Marines, however, had been unable to cross the narrow causeway leading to Tanambogo. The officer in charge told us to make a landing at Tanambogo. We had about 5 minutes of naval gunfire support prior to landing. As we were coming in, the last shell hit a fuel dump on the beach, lighting up the beach like day. As we came in, the Japs opened fire from their dugouts on the Tanambogo hill. Only 2 boatloads of our men had got ashore. The coxswain of the 3rd boat had been hit in the head by a bullet and killed, and there had been some confusion as to who was to take over the wheel. In the confusion, the boat got turned about and all the other boats followed. We on shore were jammed between 2 piers. The only cover we could get was afforded by the side of the pier. As soon as we opened fire, the Japs spotted our T-racers, and in addition we were silhouetted against the flaming oil of the fuel dump. One of the 2 boats retired, taking wounded, and Flight Officer Spencer went with it. He came back to Tanambogo when the boat returned. We found only 6 men in the boat which had been left at Tanambogo, he said. They said that the Japs had raided our positions along the piers, and that they considered Captain Crane and the other Marines had been wiped out. But Captain Crane arrived with 6 of his men. They had escaped from the Japs by hiding in the bushes. At 9 or 10 o'clock 2 more Marines returned, swimming naked toward our boats. Our people fired, but the Marines in the water yelled and were saved. After that, said Flight Officer Spencer, the remnant of Captain Crane's forces withdrew, and a much larger detachment of Marines, under Lieutenant Colonel Robert G. Hunt, landed the following morning at 4 o'clock and took Tanambogo. We talked also with kindly, affable Father James J. Fitzgerald, a Chicago priest who had accompanied the troopers on their attack at Gavutu. The moment he stepped ashore, under enemy fire, said Father Fitzgerald, the man ahead of him had been killed. After that, the priest had led a charmed existence, giving church rites to 27 dead and 47 wounded on the open Gavutu beach, despite the fact that snipers were shooting fairly continuously. We were anxious to visit the Gavutu and Tanambogo battlegrounds and secured permission to go. We went by landing boat. Our guide was a sturdy young man in high boots, a Captain Stallings. He was the temporary commanding officer. I noticed that Captain Stallings' steady blue eyes looked weary almost to the point of being haunted. He spoke in a very low voice, as if he were still under fire and did not want to give away his position through loud talking. We sat on the floor of our boat en route from Tulagi to Gavutu, for we had to pass on the way through a narrow strait where, said Captain Stallings, there were still snipers. When we had landed at the shattered concrete docks on Gavutu, Captain Stallings gave us a concise outline of the attack there. Only a few hundred troops had come in on the assault against Gavutu, said Captain Stallings, because it was expected that Jap opposition would be small. But it had turned out that there were an estimated 1,370 Japs on Gavutu and the secondary objective, Tanambogo. Here, as everywhere, the Japs had been caught by surprise, said Captain Stallings. The first company of the troops had landed with only sniper fire to harass them. The second company had met heavy fire from a distance 500 to 600 yards from shore, all the way to the beach. The third company had suffered heavy casualties while approaching the shore and landing. The troopers planned to take Gavutu first, then move on to Tanambogo, said Captain Stallings. This meant they first had to storm a steep hill, 148 feet high, on Gavutu. This hill, and another 120 feet high on Tanambogo, commanded the docks where the assault troops landed. The hills, and particularly Gavutu Hill, were honeycombed with dugout fortresses like those which had been encountered on Tulagi. The Japs manning these dugouts were well armed with machine guns, rifles, and automatic rifles. The emplacements had to be blasted with TNT, said Captain Stallings, but it was hard to finish off the Japs. A good many of the caves were connected and made a sort of labyrinth. You'd shoot at a Jap in one hole and he'd come up in another. From the dock we had a good view of the two hills, for in fact they seemed to occupy practically all of the land space on the two small islands. It was as if an overgrown beehive or anthill had been planted on each island. The two land bodies are connected by a long, narrow causeway, apparently built of seashells. We passed several concrete-walled, metal-roofed buildings as we left the dock. They had evidently been storehouses for a certain large soap company. Now the walls and roofs had been riddled by bullets and shell fragments. One of the larger buildings along the shore had been a company store. The Marines had used it as a hospital. Dr. Burke, Dr. Eisenberg, and Dr. Thorne worked here continuously for 3 days, said Captain Stallings. Under heavy fire. The Japs took special pains to throw a lot of fire into the place. Incidentally, said Captain Stallings, our casualties in the Gavutu Tanambogo campaign were 77, 27 killed and 50 wounded. The Japs had probably lost more than 800 troops. A few boatloads of them had escaped to neighbouring Florida Island, and about 5 had been taken prisoner. Captain Stallings told us the stories of some of the heroes of Gavutu as we climbed the exceedingly steep hill on the island. One of the first Marine casualties, he said, had been Major Robert H. Williams, who had led the first wave of troops trying to storm this very hill. But the outstanding hero had been Captain Harold L. Torgerson, who had blasted more than 50 Jap caves with homemade dynamite bombs. His method was to tie 30 sticks of dynamite together, run to the cave mouth while 4 of his men covered it with rifles and submachine guns, light the fuse, shove the TNT in amongst the Japs. In his day's work, Captain Torgerson had used 20 cases of dynamite and all the available matches. His wristwatch strap had been broken by a bullet which creased his wrist. But that did not stop his pyrotechnic campaign. On one occasion, said Captain Stallings, the wild and woolly Torgerson had attached a 5-gallon can of gasoline to one of his homemade bombs to make it better. That bomb went off with a great roar, knocked Torgerson down and blasted away most of his pants, as well as blowing in the roof of a Jap dugout. Torgerson's only comment, said Captain Stallings, was, "Boy, that was a pisser, wasn't it?" 2 other troopers had distinguished themselves in disposing of Japanese dugouts, said Captain Stallings. Corp for Ralph W. Fordyce had cleaned up 6 Jap emplacements, in each of which there had been at least 6 Japs. In one case he had dragged 8 Jap bodies from a dugout, which he had just entered with his submachine gun. Corp. Johnny Blackman had blown in 5 dugouts with TNT. Sergeant Max Koplow had disposed of the Japs in 2 dugouts connected by tunnels. Platoon Sergeant Harry M. Tully had picked off 3 members of a Japanese machine gun crew at an extraordinarily long range. The Japs had fought with almost unbelievable stubbornness. Some of them cached their rifles, then swam out into the water and returned at night to pick up their arms and snipe at our troops. But the Marines had fought with the greatest ferocity. There were others in the long chronicle of heroism recited by Captain Stallings as we climbed and paused at the top of Gavutu Hill, but these were outstanding. I should have liked to hunt up and talk to some of the surviving heroes of the Gavutu campaign, but our coxswain was anxious to be on the move back to Tulagi before sunset. "The Marines shoot anything that moves after dark," he said. We had only a little time left then, so we decided to round up our excursion with a quick trip to Tanambogo. Climbing down the steep Gavutu Hill, I wondered how the troops had ever succeeded in taking this island. Looking down from that precipitous hill to the strip of docks where the Marines had landed gave one the commanding feeling of looking into the palm of one's own hand. I thought then, if I did not know that the Marines had taken this island hill, I would have said that the job, especially against a well-armed, numerically superior force, was impossible. We rowed in a boat from Gavutu to Tanambogo, bypassing the long connecting causeway, where the Marines had tried without success to effect a crossing. We landed on the Tanambogo docks, where other Marine troops had finally come ashore. We passed 2 burned-out American tanks. These, said Captain Stallings, were the vanguard of the American landing. The defending Japs had jammed the treads with crowbars, swarmed over the tanks, and set them afire with rags soaked in gasoline. The Japs screamed and hollered and actually beat on the tanks with their fists, said Captain Stallings. One of the tank commanders, he said, had opened the hatch and killed 23 of the swarming Nips with a machine gun before he was stabbed to death. "I counted the bodies myself," said Stallings. On a board ramp on Tanambogo shore, we saw the remnants of 2 of the Zero float planes which had been set afire by our strafing Navy fighters. Then it was time to go back to Tulagi. The sun was beginning to go down, and the coxswain of our boat was growing more and more anxious. Back at Tulagi, there was business to attend to. We were scheduled to leave for Guadalcanal at 4:30 tomorrow morning, and I wanted to make sure that we would have a fast boat for the return trip. I was certain that the Jap who had chased us today would be lying off the harbour entrance, waiting. We got the boat, for General Rupertus had heard of our narrow escape this morning and knew our predicament. But the longer I thought about the trip, the more convinced I became that it would be suicidal. I was sure that the Jap would be so placed that it would be impossible to escape from him as we left the harbour. His detector would locate us easily, and of course our little boat, with only machine guns as protection, would be no match for the sub. We bedded down on the floor of a shack very near the Tulagi dock, so that when we moved in the morning we would not have to pass a line of sentries. I lay awake for hours, tortured by the thought that if we were not fools, we would wait until we could make the trip by air. How about the PBY which had flown into Guadalcanal this morning? Was the thought that suddenly occurred to me. I stepped over the sleeping officers in the shack, waked one who would know, and asked if the PBY could be called on to ferry us back. He said no, that the PBY had already left Guadalcanal and returned to base. I suggested that we might wait until air support arrived at Guadalcanal Airport. That would make our trip safe. But we were carrying dispatches back to Guadalcanal and could not wait an indefinite period of time until our aircraft showed up. We would have to take our chances. I felt better then, knowing that we had no alternative except to run for it. But it seemed to me inevitable that we would be caught and sunk, for the sub had obviously decided this morning that we were some sort of official boat worth chasing and worth waiting for. I sat on the front steps of the shack under the soft white stars, and thought that this would be my last night of life. I thought that all in all it had been a good life, although it seemed to be ending a little early. Thursday, August 13. We were up at 4 this morning and down to the dock in the dark. The night had turned cold, as is usual in this climate. The sky had been blacked out by a low overcast. There were to be 2 boats in our fleet. One was our own landing boat, the other a small 80 which was to carry Jap prisoners back to Guadalcanal. Now the prisoners, their hands up, were being led into the small hold of the lighter. There were 10 prisoners, 3 of them Navy troops, the other 7 uniformed labourers. They took their places silently, obediently, as if they expected to be taken out into the bay and drowned, and were resigned to their fate. And so we started out, showing a prearranged signal to warn outposts against shooting at us. And once past the line of sentries, we crept along at a low speed, hugging the cover of the shoreline. The water was rough, and despite our low speed, we were drenched by spray. At about 5 o'clock, we thought the jig was up. A white point of light like a bright star appeared in the sky to the south, and then the star burgeoned into a greater brightness, casting a flickering sheet of light over the whole sky. It was a flare. The sub, we thought, was looking for us. Another flare, closer and more directly ahead of us, followed a few moments later. We went through certain manoeuvres, which for security reasons cannot be described, to confuse the Japs who at that moment were probably listening to our propeller beat and trying to fix our location through their detector. We resumed our course some 15 minutes later, and there were no more flares. But several times more we went through manoeuvres designed to throw off the enemy. It was 6 o'clock in the morning, and the sky was growing uncomfortably light when we passed the last protecting shoulder of land and headed out into the open bay. There would be no land within easy swimming distance now until we had nearly finished our trip. This was our dash for life. The coxswain opened the throttle wide, and we pounded hard into the short, high, choppy waves. Solid water began to sluice over the bow in sheets. We were drenched anew with each wave, and the wind was chilling, but we did not slow down. This was no time for comfort. Somewhere we had lost a lot of time, fallen far behind our schedule. We had planned to be out in the middle of the bay by 6:30, but at that time we were only a few hundred yards away from the shores of the Tulagi group of islands. But the submarine, we thank our stars, did not appear. We found later that he had been sighted across the bay, along the Guadalcanal shore at about that time. Halfway across the bay, the coxswain turned to me and said, "Our chances are about 1 in 3 of getting there now." But whatever our chances at that moment, they had certainly improved greatly. The high, cloud-girdled mountains of Guadalcanal were becoming more and more distinct ahead of us. We would be there soon, if we did not spot a sub. Then we were close enough to Guadalcanal to see isolated palm trees clearly against the skyline and rows of bamboo shacks. We knew we were going to make it. Back at Colonel Hunt's command post, where I am billeted, I heard some bad news. That Colonel Goetje, Lieutenant Corey, Captain Ringer, and several others of our personnel are missing on an excursion to Matanikau. Also old Dr. Pratt, the incorrigible adventurer, who went along with the expedition for the fun of it. The story is that a Japanese prisoner offered to take Colonel Goetke to the village with the contention that the Japs were willing to surrender. So Colonel Goetke took a party of 26 officers and men and set out in a landing boat for Matanikau. The party made a night landing, ran smack into the middle of a Jap ambush. Colonel Goetke was the first man hit. Only 3 of the party escaped by swimming down the coast to Kukum. They were Corp, Joseph Spaulding, Sergeant Charles C. Arndt, and Sergeant Frank L. Few. Few and Arndt killed 3 Japs each in the course of the fight. Sergeant Few is a swarthy, 22-year-old half-Indian, vastly respected by the men because he is, as the Marines say, really rugged. This means he is a tough hombre, and Few certainly looks the part. He has fierce dark eyes, a wiry, muscular body, and he moves with the swift ease of a cat. A flashing white smile, sideburns, and scraggly black beard and moustache only intensify the effect. Sergeant Few told me the story of the ill-fated expedition to Matanikau. He was still a little shaky from the experience. They got Colonel Goetke in the chest right quick. Spaulding and I went up to him, but when I put a hand on him, I knew he was dead. Just then I saw somebody close by. I challenged him, and he let out a war whoop and came at me. My submachine gun jammed. I was struck in the arm and chest with his bayonet, but I knocked his rifle away. I choked him and stabbed him with his own bayonet. Knowing Colonel Goethe was dead, said Few, he started back to join our other Marines who had landed. Then he suddenly spotted a Jap in the fork of the two trees. My own gun was still jammed, he said, so I borrowed Aunt's pistol and shot the Jap 7 times. I got my gun to working after that, but I couldn't use the magazine. I had to stick a cartridge in the chamber each time I wanted to shoot. I could only fire 1 shot at a time. Just then I saw another Jap. I let one go and it hit him in the face. Then I bashed him with the butt of my gun. When he got back to the main body of Marines, Few found they were dug in for a fight. He dug in too, using his helmet and hands, and there followed a long exchange of shooting. Several other Americans had been hit, notably Lute, Corey, the interpreter, with a bullet in the stomach, and Captain Ringer. The Japs were closing in for the kill when the sky began to grow light with a pre-dawn glow. Spaulding had earlier made a break for the beach, started to swim for Kukum. Aunt followed, and then Few, stripping down to his underclothes, made a dash for the water. "It was the end of the rest on the beach," said Few. "The Japs closed in and hacked up our people. I could see swords flashing in the sun." Few had to swim 4.5 miles to reach Kukum, and there are sharks in that water, but he made it. When I talked to him only a few hours later, he did not seem physically tired at all. I went to General Vandergrift's headquarters, where a table, an unusual luxury on Guadalcanal, was available for typing. But it was difficult to do any work. There were 3 air raid alarms which kept us on the run, although no Japs materialized. Guadalcanal Airport, I find, has turned out to be quite a prize. The runways, it is said at headquarters, are excellent. One huge runway is 3,778 feet long and 160 feet wide, and was surfaced with coral gravel and cement, except for a strip 197 feet long when we arrived. Shelters for planes had also been set up by the Japs, and they had left behind 5 steamrollers, 2 tractors, a large cache of first-quality cement, and a system of electric lights running the length of the runway. Back at my tent tonight, I felt a loneliness which could not be gainsaid. Lieutenant Corey and Dr. Pratt, both of whom are missing and believed dead on the last Matanikau excursion, bunked in this tent. The rest of us in the tent, Major Phipps, Captain Narder and Captain Dixon, lay awake talking for some time, and that helped to allay the shock of worrying about and wondering if we had lost our friends. During the night I awoke and listened, and watched the segment of sky I could see through the tent door. There were flashes of white light and distant rumblings coming from the north. I heard the other men in the tent stirring. They too were watching the sky and listening. We lay a long time silently, and then Don Dixon summed up our thoughts. "It's only a storm," he said. The rest of us had come to the same conclusion. We joked a little about our jittery nerves and went back to a fitful sleep.